When our desires are rolling out and not meeting any abstractions, life is not a problem. In other words, there's no possibility for that, what is created here, a predisposition. So once we have that understanding, how do you work with anger? How can one work with anger? This is where we go to the domain of emotions. We go into the domain of the full spectrum of emotional responses, where we learn that whether we like it or not, it is the full gamut of emotions that makes us who we are in terms of our responses. And anger takes that place within that spectrum. So in other words, no matter how negative it was spoken of or understood to be, it's, as it were, there because it has the purpose.
So my question is about anger. And I was watching a YouTube clip by Francis Lucille about anger a few days ago. And he kept on saying, you just enjoy it, to the person who was angry. And he was saying, no, I don't enjoy it. I don't want to be angry. I want to finish. I don't want to go into it. I want to get rid of my anger somehow. And what I'm noticing is that both my husband and I are going through quite a powerful something is happening between us where all the repressed anger that we've had since our childhood is coming out in such a with such a force. And I know that my integration and my spiritual practice is really having a wonderful effect, because I can see in the heat of the moment, sometimes when I'm right in it and I'm feeling it, and recently I felt this while I'm in the middle, screaming my head off. This like big mountain appeared in my consciousness. Like I could enter it, and it was all happening, but there was this distance. I could feel my whole pattern coming in, and I'm shouting, and yet there was this calm entering in, and it was just a really powerful experience of being taken in, but at the same time having that distance. And then in that split second, I started laughing in a way that wasn't sarcastic, but I just laughed and said, "Hey, this is funny. I mean, it's serious, but it's kind of funny." And we started laughing and crying, and it was beautiful. And so we're having these sometimes these big arguments that come from very subconscious or unconscious bodily realms, that because of my practice, I think I'm able to bring it up to the surface now. It's all coming up now. And my question is, if in this process I'm to integrate everything and all the things that I've kept hidden and that lie in the recess of my consciousness, it's all coming up. Is there a point where there's the reservoir will end, where it just carries on, and I'm just detached from it, and it's okay, and that's the whole point. You allow it to come, you enter into it. Even if we learn about the emotions, anger is one of them, so it's not bad to have anger. You're just not identifying it in a way or pushing it down. But is it just something that will keep coming in waves, whatever happens in my journey. And I know I'm doing things right by allowing it, by accepting it, by doing it together with my husband in a loving container. Is that it?
So what is it that you actually asking? Would the anger go
Yeah.
one day?
Will that, all that childhood repression?
Okay. So this is the question of anger has several layers and perspectives that unless we speak about something very specific, we can begin to address that with accuracy. But if we speak about it in terms of anger per se, I think it would be helpful to understand at least what anger and how anger is viewed, let's say, in spiritual traditions. You see? So, and then when we have that understanding, we can view anger also in terms of its place within the scope of our emotional responses. And then we will be able to understand what is anger, why we have anger as a response, what are the driving mechanisms, principles, so as not to only accept, which is very important, to be fine with the expression of what anger stands for, but also, more importantly, that we create a possibility where the consciousness that opens up because of the field of its inquiry, where that, what you speak now in particular, let's say, because you refer to that as that suppressed or repressed anger that was not allowed to be expressed for whatever reasons. These reasons can be many, right? The way we were brought up in terms of our environment, family situations, social setups, schools, right? So in other words, this can all definitely be traced back to at what point and how this emotion got into repression. But let us first, I suggest, maybe remind ourselves what anger is, at least in terms of the scriptural influence, in terms of how, let's say, anger is understood, in terms of its reference with regard to some of the primordial energies. And we will borrow example from the Bhagavad Gita, where in the exchanges between Arjuna and Krishna, there is this part where anger is being addressed. And interestingly enough, Krishna speaks of anger as the most evil of all in terms of its manifesting energy as being a result of a flurrying of Rajaguna. Rajaguna. So now we're going back to these primordial energies of Sattva, Tamas, and Rajas. And Rajaguna is being held accountable for creating a predisposition which, given the circumstances, will flare as anger. What are these circumstances? The circumstances are such when our desire is met with abstraction. Primal example, any of you who have children know that very well, or work with children now. You know that soon when everything is allowed, in other words, the desire that naturally bubbles, froths up and springs forth, and we go with the desires of the child, everything is okay. But soon as we, okay, that enough is enough, okay, that one lollipop, two lollipops, like this, that, okay, that's enough. The child will not have that. Child will erupt with anger. we could say, well, I'm not a child, but the principle, the mechanics are the same. When our desires are rolling out and not meeting any abstractions, life is not a problem. In other words, there's no possibility for that, what is created here, a predisposition. Because Rajaguna is what in itself known as the primordial force behind all desires. Sattva is equilibrium, right? Now just this reminds those of you who are not familiar with this concept. Can you raise your hand, those of you who have never heard about Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas? All of you have heard about it, right? Just give me a nod, give me a thumb. Okay, great, amazing, amazing audience. So, in Sattva, nothing is lacking. In Sattva, there is no lack. Sattva in itself is equilibrium. So, obviously, cannot be blamed. Tamaguna is structure. Tamaguna is that what is physiology in itself. Tamaguna is that what is ruled by gravity, that what is this viscosity of everything. So again, you see, desire cannot be applicable to that. Rajaguna is what creates the desire and spins it. We can speak about it philosophically. If not for Rajaguna, there will be no desire to do anything. But we'll leave that aside. We want to now pinpoint and understand the mechanics of the flare of anger. So if Rajaguna's purpose and Rajaguna's expression is to move the desire forth, then it means we are constantly under the swell of this or that desire. And up until these desires do not meet with any abstractions, there is no problem. But soon as the desire is met with abstraction, in other words, any unfulfilled desire is a recipe for the accumulation of anger. These are the mechanics. It's very important to understand these mechanics. In other words, it's not because we are angry about something. We are angry per se, because our desire met with abstraction. That lolly from the shelf is no longer given. Whatever that lolly in a given moment in time now represents in my life, I want the lolly. Lollipop. I want the lollipop. I want to suck it in my mouth and feel happy, because the sugar gets that impact, at least temporarily. But I'm not given a lolly, so I will throw a tantrum. You see, as a child I can throw a tantrum now, as an adult I cannot. So I will bite my lip. But the anger is there, of course, already where it is formed. This is at least the perspective expounded in the Bhagavad Gita, in the verses very clearly. Also offered as a reminder of how to work with this. In other words, the progressive dialogue will unfold where be, nistrai, guna, bhavarjana, be without the three gunas, eventually without all the three of them. In other words, go beyond, go to the field of pure transcendence, beyond the domain of the gunas. But the Rajaguna is the one that is being held accountable for anger. And anger in turn is being also addressed as the most destructive. Just as fire is the most destructive element. Fire here and anger are equated. Anger causes damage, just as fire causes damage. It has the quality that burns everything, you see? So the expression of anger here held accountable for spoiling the quality of our life. And this is what needs to be understood at that level. It's very important. So just to jump, or rather bypass into, well, anger is one of the emotions, one of the spectrum. We will come to that in a moment. But if we do that leap, which will be on par with bypassing, we fail to understand and correlate what anger here represents. Anger, without a shadow of a doubt, is not something to be proud about. We know that very well. When we feel angry, we're out of whack. It is the anger that destabilizes us the most. It is the anger that spoils everything. You can be in the midst of a fantastic whatever, and then suddenly you're angry. The enjoyment is gone. Wherever you happen to be, whatever the most conducive environment one is in, if anger came, it burned it. You see, just as any fantastic, fabulous food on a stove burned is of no use. You cannot eat it. It's burned. No? In the same way, anger here is equated with fire because it has the quality that burns. So it's spoken in negative terms. In other words, it's something one needs to work with. So once we have that understanding, how do you work with anger? How can one work with anger? This is where we go to the domain of emotions. We go into the domain of the full spectrum of emotional responses, where we learn that whether we like it or not, it is the full gamut of emotions that makes us who we are in terms of our responses. And anger takes that place within that spectrum. So in other words, no matter how negative it was spoken of or understood to be, it's as it were there because it has the purpose. What purpose? Maybe it's not yet known to us, or maybe intuited. Whether we like it or not, maybe, well, let's see, right? Oh, have you been in the tropics? Have you ever lived in the tropics? Do you know when the sun, every single day, and the weather is fantastic, when you go for a week to two, you enjoy that greatly. But I can tell you, because I lived in the tropics, and I can tell you how a great day, let alone rain and thunder, it feels welcoming. It's not feel welcoming living in London, I'm sorry, when it pisses all the time, cats and dogs, you know. But it feels very welcoming because it brings this very different flavor amidst the otherwise uninterrupted sunshine all the time. Maybe that's wrong understanding, wrong perspective. Let's see how it goes. So this is at least, we give the possibility of why anger exists in the first place. So we go to the full spectrum of our emotional interactions. And what now, at the level of our work, at the level of working with emotions, is important, is to distinguish where we come from in terms of that spectrum. This belongs to the Rasavada, the theory of rasas, and how this is experienced. We've unpacked that in our immersions, and you were privy to that. In fact, we had some exchanges, you and I, on this in depth, I would even say, for the audience, where we spoke about these different rasas, different flavors, these different tastes. So when it comes to the tasting, savoring, when we have this clarity where the coming and going of each of the states has this sweeping movement of the good watch mechanism. The timepiece is designed in such a way that you look at it and it's just sweepingly moving around. We don't want to be stuck on 12 or quarter past. We don't want to be somewhere. What we notice, and we must notice, what becomes our predominant emotional response. Because it is the response here that is very important. If our predominant response is colored by certain unprocessed, in the case of what you just brought out, perhaps this repressed anger over years, maybe lifetime, will become that emotional response. And you notice that. This is where you become honest in your introspection. And that's what is spoken in terms of fasting on rasas in the forthcoming book on Chamatkara. As you know very well, there is a part, as someone who is taking part in this project, there is this part where we talk about fasting, right? So you know you are addicted to certain emotions. So when the sweeping clock of all these emotional states is in perfectly oiled mechanism, then there's nothing to worry about. You see? The trouble comes when we realize that somehow we become addicted to a certain emotional response. Anger is one of them. You see? There could be an opposite of that, because anger has this quality of defense, even aggression. It can be expressed in a different way. It can be expressed by shutting oneself down or off. It can be expressed by being passive-aggressive. It can be expressed in so many different ways, right? Down to violent ways. But the other opposite of that could be, let's say, an emotional response of the withdrawal, sadness, an emotional response where we are not available. You see? So in other words, it doesn't have to be only anger. And again, if one has the capacity to trace that, to see whether this emotion become a predominant psychological response to anything that pushes our buttons. Soon as someone pressed the button, what comes out is this emotional response. Okay, next time, again this emotional response. And then again. Then it's the time to take it into one's hands and introduce the fasting of the rasas. This is very important. And this is where you consciously observe this, when and how this emotional state takes over, because the anger takes over, like emotional states take over, just like melancholy. Everything was fine, suddenly everything becomes kind of blue, first blue, just blue. Well, it's blue, kind of blue, you know, like jazzy, kind of still nice, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, right? Kind of blue, but then it's become bluer, getting into darker shades of blue. Then the grays mix into that, and in no time it's very, very drab and grim and not very exciting, not, very, very, so yeah, it's like we suddenly subjected to that state and we totally no longer present to that froth of what otherwise could be. So once we notice that, this is where indication of whether anger is a natural response. Natural, for example, if our boundaries are violated, right? It's not like we are suddenly starting to play Mahatma Gandhi here, or, whatever, this or that Teresa. We have to be honest. And when we are honest, we know even the sages have the patience and the limits. If our boundaries are violated, you know what? Get the out of my face kind of thing is also can be spoken, of course, in the Shakespearean language as well. If you can say that, like get lost in a very, very sort of poetic way, whilst being authentic with that, you are the better off. I'm still learning how to express myself when I'm really out of it, so that it doesn't sound offensive. But not always happens. This anger is nothing to worry about because it belongs to that spectrum. Something is violated, that is a response. It's natural because this is within the range of psychic responses. Or I could be suddenly feel, because these responses now, and we're making another leap here, primarily connect us to the primitive responses. Let us not forget, negative and positive, spoken relatively. However, let's not just sweep it with the same brush. Either way, they are negative and they are positive responses. And we know that. We know when we smell poop and when we smell the roses. Let's not just try to pretend all this smell of Brahman. No. Right? We go through great length to smell nice things. And this is a very good example because that is one of those that one doesn't want to tolerate. The same is here. So, negative emotions versus positive emotions is very important to understand that negative emotions connect us to the primitive responses of survival. And negative emotions here are, and the way we are wired, connects us to this primarily fight, flight, or freeze. You translate them now, what will be fight, flight, and freeze syndromes, you see? This is biologically how we are wired, but because we are much more sophisticated beings, right? This is how that walnut-shaped brain that we shared with dinosaurs and reptilians, then covered by the emotional, newly developed brain, which is all about emotions. And then on top, like a big, huge bean shape, this is like a bean shape, but then a bigger part of the brain, which is all to do with capacity to think, create, and ultimately transcend. In the prefrontal lobes is the capacity to go beyond any of that, beyond emotion, beyond feeling, beyond thought, beyond that what experience provides, transcending. But in its essence, negative emotion, one way or another, linked to the survival mechanisms. So one who is more prompted to fight will have that response. Someone who wants to flee will have another response. And someone who freezes or prefers to freeze, you see? And you translate that into what emotional states that represents. None of them are joyful to be. And we need to be honest about that. So when these states are natural, an outcome of any stimuli, that when our boundaries are in any way invaded, let alone violated, it's a natural response, and we are not ashamed of that. Doesn't mean that I'm feeling suddenly a lizard or reptilian. No, this is part of being human. Human means being everything. All of it. All of it. All the demons, angels, dragons, whatever, the creatures, including all the divine beings and all the way to the heavenly manna, all here. So this is our understanding. But when it comes to the anger, this need to be clearly distinguished. Just letting it go, like in where you started your question and you brought an example. I don't know whether the aforementioned teacher was speaking about enjoy. It means you are enjoying it, the one who brought that inquiry. Whether this means that, he must be enjoying it, therefore you enjoy until you no longer enjoy it, or something else. I cannot tell, you see? But as the topic itself, anger is not a pleasant experience. And it is not an experience that one should simply consider to be, well, that's how I am, that's who I am. You see, this is like, I'm angry, I'm pissed off all the time. Well, tough titty, this is it. Yes, maybe it's a good first step, to acknowledge as on par with accepting. But we don't stop at that level. We have to examine. This is what emotional introspection in this work represents. Emotional introspection is so that there is this capacity to feel everything, emote, but whilst never being subjected to the addiction which a certain emotion can impose on us. And that's the aspect of the addiction that we speak of, because it reinforces itself. There is a circuit, there's a connection, because it's gut and brain, it's the psychophysiological phenomena. It's the whole compote of what endocrine system produces when we are under impact of anger. We physically experience that creates this and immediately creates the predisposition for reacting in that same way, because that whatever that was the result of suppression present itself now in a form of addiction. So in other words, we need to also acknowledge what emotions we are addicted to. And this is the most difficult thing. Funny enough, particularly when it comes to the negative emotions. You see? It's easy. I'm addicted to be in love. I'm addicted to be in love. Kind of like, it sounds good. I'm addicted to anger. Does that sound the same? Maybe, but I'm not sure. So addiction here doesn't add value into our life. So this is where there is anger and there is anger. And we need to know the difference. So, and maybe just to what you have shared personally, that this, amidst of that experience itself, which could be either which washes us or, taking us over. And at the same time, there is this inner, like void-like or rock-like. You give example of the mountain, right? The rock, yes, very apt. There is this stillness. Nothing moves actually at the core. So the whole, thing, the whole cyclone, the whole, hurricane, whatever that present itself at the core, at the very epicenter, at the core, at the heart, everything is fine. So this repeatedly experienced, of course, brings this realization of, like the humor, the humor aspect of it, or that changeability of the emotion, right? Where it comes in. So also to be distinguished from when we're losing it, because when we're losing, we also, the shift from one emotion to a very contradictory emotion is also part and parcel. But it's a very different thing, if it's accompanied by that, or rather invoked by that realization of inner stillness, of which I know very well what you speak of when these states take over, then it means that we are somehow finding ways where we can actually enjoy and be masters in the house rather than being slaves to our emotions, slaves to what we feel, slaves to what we go through.